Hey, Jeremy.
It worked.
It does. It does. I'm terrible at this technology. Normally, I've got Matthew that works for me, and he's absolutely fantastic, and he sorts it all out. And since he's been on holiday, it's all gone wrong. So come back, Matt. Come back. Anyway, great to see you.
Rule number one, don't let them have holidays.
Well, that's right. Anyway, so fantastic to see you. Thanks ever so much for joining us.
No worries.
Today,
Thank you.
and this is going to go into the latest edition of Punchline. I thought it'd be a good idea to put it in context of where we are, and obviously how I got to know you, if that's okay. So it's been quite a while. I used to be chairman of the Federation of Small Business, if anybody's interested. And I was invited, I went to a board meeting. I don't know if you know this, Jen, but I was invited to a board meeting. It's the only second meeting I'd ever been to. And they said, oh, they're setting up a new company. And it's called the Gloucester Heritage Urban Regeneration Company. Does anybody want to do it? And nobody put their hands up. And it was only my second meeting. And I thought, well, I'll do that. And I ended up staying there for 8.5 years and meeting you at the same time. So a lot of people don't know the background. I've dug out this. Jeremy, remember this very well. You and I are in here, actually. I'll see this generation. I shall find that later. I was going to do slides and things, but it goes back to the original thing with Matt not being here. But can you remember that?
Brunswick Road, yes. Yeah,
right.
Another one I'm responsible for. There's quite a lot of those dotted around this county.
I know. Well, I thought that would be a good starting point, actually, because obviously Brunswick Road and the old college, Gloucester. So is that where you work, Jem? How did you get there?
Yeah, I worked at Gloucestershire College, and it was shortly after Greg Smith arrived as the new principal. He made me vice principal, and I was responsible for HR and property and all sorts of things. It was unfortunately at a point when further education was going through the doldrums, and we found ourselves bankrupt. Not a great place to be. We restructured all the staffing, sorted out what was a very expensive staffing structure, and resolved that. It was a historic legacy. The college used to be what's often referred to as a mixed economy, and a lot of higher education. All that work had gone to the university or higher education college it was at the time, but we had very expensive staff left who we basically had to pay at higher education rates, but were teaching further education. So we had a huge issue which sorted that out, which took us a couple of years, and then we started saying the next target's got to be the estate, and because that was just hemorrhaging cash all over the place. We started in Cheltenham simply because it was a case of it was the simplest deal to do, because there was a huge value gradient. We were selling a very expensive site and buying one much cheaper. That's how the college moved up to just round the corner from GCHQ. When we'd done that, the governors then set me the task of saying, this is all very well, but we want one in Gloucester, and it's urgent.
What year was that? Sorry to disturb you. What year was this then, Jim?
That would have been around year 2000. So we were already just well into the construction phase at Cheltenham, and they were absolutely adamant that they wanted something to happen in Gloucester. They just said, it's in such a state, we can't let this carry on. I had looked at the docks around that time with Graham Garbutt, who of course was the chief exec of the city council at the time. And Graham was actually a bit of a visionary, and it was Graham who brought in the regional development agency to acquire significant interest in the docks to unlock the whole thing. We completed Cheltenham and around 2001, 2, somewhere around there. And then I was given a very clear target by the governors and Greg, can you build us a new college in the docks? But, that's where we want to be. So first of all, it was finding a site, which is the one we ended up on. Lots of shenanigans. It was not easy. It went to public inquiry, the whole of the Keys scheme. And then in the background, it was the Regional Development Agency and English Partnerships, as was in those days, both defunct bodies now, but had huge firepower and great resources, great people. And they literally came in, sorted problems out and left. That was their kind of mantra. They didn't necessarily hang around that long. So I was basically loaned to them. And basically I was the resource on the ground in the docks. And my job was to try and pull together the URC, which was with the RDA English Partnerships and the Great and the Good sort of thing. It was then that they requested that Greg actually chaired it. So very much I could kind of step away because my focus was very much delivering the college. But it was kind of, it was dangerous times because people had to be brave. And if you had a vision, you had to stick with it. So I remember being drawn into the public inquiry. The MP at that time would have been Parmjit Danda. I remember writing his script for him. Parmjit will deny that, but I did. The inquiry was actually stopped at one moment, and I said, well, if we're going to talk about the college, why don't we just walk across to it? Because by this stage, the steel was going up. Because we played a bit of a trick where we'd actually, whilst we were part of the Gloucester Quay scheme, we'd actually separated it and ran a parallel ship where I actually got detailed consent to build the college, and the governor said, go for it. So we went, but of course the big risk was that we'll be there, just sat there in splendid isolation to see a dereliction. So I have to say the governors were pretty brave, and I said, no, it'll be all right, trust me. That's how we got there. So that's really how I got dragged or involved with the URC. And then from there...
I'll just stop you there because about the URC, because many people don't know about the Gloucester Heritage Urban Regeneration Company. There was a board of 25, and you are right, it was the Great and the Good. It was the Gloucester City Council, Gloucestershire County Council, the SWERDA, there was English Heritage, wasn't there? There was, I was there as the chairman of the Federation of Small Business. We had the a regeneration panel from the community as well, somebody representing from the community. All in all, there was 25 people around that table that Greg Smith had to chair, and then Ian Mean was the vice chair. That's how I remembered it. And then you had the council officers sitting around the edge. So all in all, there's like 35, 40 people in a room that would meet once a month. And of course, it all transpired, all was working to the Magnificent Seven, as it was called. Sorry, just what I put it there to explain.
Yeah. No. And so my involvement, I was working particularly with Peel and British Waterways to unlock what effectively became the first of the stepping stones, which in actual fact was the college. And the thing the college did that most people didn't understand, it just created immediate footfall. Out of nowhere, you had several thousand, people a day crossing the docks. I think the person that made the smartest move was the person who bought that little Subway shop. I think they must be the richest person in Gloucester by now. It was a really smart move, but it kind of, it suddenly unlocked all that potential, because literally the contractor I was using, which at the time was Bovis Lend-Lease, they literally shipped across the canal and went straight on to build the quays. Same contractor. And then once that got started, then Sainsbury's said they wanted to build, and suddenly you have this kind of, it's just generating that momentum and that can-do kind of spirit, but somebody's got to go first. Like I say, it was pretty dangerous because, had it gone wrong, I'd have probably I'd be looking for another job.
I mean, that's the other thing, is that people don't realise sometimes that obviously, Gloucester Quays was so run down, wasn't it? Peel, invested, I think it was £600 million. And then, of course, then you had the bridge that used to go to nowhere by the Pizza Hut. I remember explaining to my kids that actually that road used to go to Never Neverland. I used to tell them. And then you had the old, I think it was a Chinese takeaway or something. No, it was a bowling alley, wasn't it, on the left-hand side? And then the old cinema as well. Most people only went to the cinema and maybe Toys R Us and Burger King, and that was as far over to Gloucester that they used to come. So, if you lived in Aberdale or Churchtown, you never came over to this side of the city. You would go straight to Cheltenham, and people who lived in the forest, they would never come to Gloucester. They would always go over to Cheltenham. So it must have been extremely difficult to get the big developers to come along and believe in the city.
Yeah, it still remains a challenge, I think. A lot's going on, but there's still a lot more to do. And I think the further we get into the current recession and, the dangers that brings, I think, the battle's not over. It will go on. But I think for the college, as that sort of almost anchor tenant, it was a really good move. And the college has always performed very well. And then, of course, I picked up almost 2 legacy projects from that. So Lansney Secunda Priory for my sins.
Yeah.
Because obviously the college was actually building, basically part of the college is built on a scheduled ancient monument, which is the remains of Lansney Priory and would have been the cloisters, long robbed out, but was still scheduled. So after lots of negotiations with English Heritage, I got to know them extremely well, and they were desperate to salvage Lansney Priory, which at the time belonged to the city council. But the city, unfortunately, to be honest, was just overblessed. It had more historic buildings than it knew what to do with, and something, the wrong side of the canal was just like, it's too difficult, it's too difficult. So we set up a trust, a little band of us, bought the site for £1 from the city council, and I think 13 years later, it finally looks like something it should do. So that was a good result. And then the other legacy was I ended up, although I left the college to work elsewhere into Cheltenham, the college retained me because they wanted me to actually finish the hat trick and actually build a college in the Forest of Dean. At the time, the college was just merging with the Forest of Dean. And there were, again, significant challenges with the Forest as a going further education college. It had a very expensive cost base, and it was kind of all stuff we all kind of thought, we've been here before, and very expensive estate. And we just said, well, we wrote the accommodation strategy and said, well, we'll only do it to this, this was to the sector estate, we'll only do it if there's support for us actually building a new college and starting again, because we don't want a 1950s, 60s grammar school that's been abandoned and just left as an FE college. It's not fit for purpose. And that took a long time. That took me 9 years of my life, believe it or not.
Wow.
So I think in that phase of my life, I did 3 FE colleges, which actually equates to, I think, 50% of the whole of the further education sector for the county, because that only leaves Cirencester, Stroud and Hartpury. The rest I dealt with. And then Lansney Priory. And then after that, of course, I actually upped sticks and moved to Cheltenham.
So were you headhunted to go to Cheltenham, or how did that come about?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was approached. By, it was a strange combination. It was a combination of councillors and the executive from Cheltenham Borough. And initially, I was just kind of on loan to them. They just kept saying, "We don't understand why everything you touch works out, and you have great projects and the rest of it, and everything we do, it never happens." And I was like, right. So I actually went and worked there a couple of days a week, just for a few months, just to kind of try and unravel and understand what was happening. And as a result, I wrote them probably quite a damning report, which said, actually, pretty sadly, but the structures you've got, they never will deliver, because actually you're not that interested. You love the process, but you don't like the outcomes and the product and the pain you have to get through to get there. And so as a consequence, they said, well, what should we do? And I basically said, well, it was kind of like the URC, but light touch, because this was back 2009. So it was about the point when the URCs were probably falling out of favour. We created a very light touch URC. So kept all the principles. So it was public, private. It had lead cabinet members, this sort of thing at county and district level. But most importantly, it had a whole load of big hitters from industry and the community sector, of course. But we kept it quite a lot smaller. So it was, I think we kept it at 17. So it was kind of just about the limit we thought was manageable. And it was different because I was the sole member of staff, and the first 2 years I basically was a free gift to them, because the RDA and what was then the Homes and Communities Agency, they said they would put some funding in to say, we'll get you going by helping to fund Gem's Post. And of course I was still doing a day a week for the college, just starting to unravel the Forest of Dean. So for the first 2 years, I just became a very cheap good for them. So anything I touched was free for them. And then after that, they decided they really liked the model, because we'd started to unpick stuff. And after that, I then became basically employed directly by CBC. And I've been there 10 years.
So how did you get the brewery done, and where do you actually start regeneration a city like Gloucester, or regeneration of Cheltenham? Because let's be honest, a lot of obviously Cheltenham is always not looking down on Gloucester. Well, yes, looking down at Gloucester up to a certain point, but Cheltenham itself had its own problems, the brewery and all the rest of it. Where did you start with Cheltenham?
I inherited a legacy project called Civic Pride. And it was something that the Regional Development Agency had focused on right across the whole of the Southwest region. And some places delivered, so places like Truro, all their schemes were delivered. Western-super-Mare delivered quite a few. Cheltenham, nil. So they talked about it a lot. They did lots of consultation, but didn't actually get around to deliver anything. So I started with that, but then also looking at what were the issues. So the brewery, for example, brewery phase 1, which was when the cinema was built, and you remember there was a very nasty 1960s shopping precinct that prevented you getting to the brewery unless you went through the service yard. It was just, you know, but that had ended up in a public inquiry, which kind of reflected the sort of the lack of appetite for growth and development that Cheltenham had started to give. And when I started talking to developers, I remember I went to see somebody down in London not long after I started. And he was just like, I don't know what you're doing, Jem. It's not like you, but you really are wasting your time in Cheltenham because, you know, he said, you know, if you're coming up the M5, he said, turn left for Gloucester. He said, it's all okay. Turn right for Cheltenham. He said, and nothing ever happens. And that was the kind of message I was given repeatedly. So we started by kind of saying, well, we need some early wins, and we also need to start changing that dynamic because it was quite clear that there was, although Cheltenham had fared reasonably well, it was starting to show it was losing its competitive edge very markedly. And I know within, I think it was in the first 3 months of me arriving, there was one of the retail surveys, and Cheltenham had fallen something like 20 places overnight. And that was a bit of a wake-up call. And that kind of, I think, started to kind of seal the thought that actually you had to do something, that sitting back and doing nothing actually wasn't, you actually were sliding backwards. If you do nothing and other people are moving, and of course by then the Quays was getting moving, various other sites, Cribbs Causeway was up and running, Birmingham had just started on the boring, and so, you know, so basically by doing nothing you were just sliding backwards very, very rapidly, and that's what the data was showing them. So we've always been kind of quite data led in some ways by kind of just watching what's going on, but also it was more about confidence. A lot of people just had a very negative experience of the planning system in Cheltenham. So it wasn't like Gloucester, where Gloucester had that unholy marriage of both a challenging planning environment but also market failure. Cheltenham didn't really have that. It had a very negative planning perspective, but it was also, as a consequence, basically the market failure was starting to creep in because people saying, there's no point, we spend all this money and all we ever get is a rejection, and we've got to go to appeal, and we just can't face this anymore. We just, you know, we can go to Gloucester, and of course at the same time, Gloucester Business Park was developing all sorts of things. So it was, yeah, it was quite challenging. So we picked a few projects and started to work with people closely. So with the brewery, which is actually National Farmers Union, NFU, but in particular, it was being managed by Martin Commercial Property. And Bob and his son, Phil, I said, look, we need to start again because we need to kind of almost reset the clock. Round one, you end up in a public inquiry. We don't want to go there. If we use the task force, what we find is let's get everybody behind it. Let's get it quite clear that this is something, you know, Cheltenham wants, and then we'll just drive it through. And that's exactly what we did. The task force got foursquare behind it. Everybody said this is a great idea. You know, it's a form of madness having a cinema that nobody can actually connect to. It's a nasty block. Let's get rid of it. Everything that had been there before, people got really excited about because it used to be Pate School and all the rest of it. But of course, that all gone in the 60s. We said, well, is there anything worth salvaging? Answer, no. So that allowed us to kind of almost start getting some credibility. And then we started on quite a few other projects. So John Lewis was another interesting one. So the Beechwood Arcade was owned by BlackRock, one of the single largest property holders in Britain, American-based. And I was fortunate that I met the guy who just become the head of property there, and he had a very interesting conundrum. He'd taken the job, but there was a sting in the tail, which was, oh, there's one piece of this portfolio. It's called the Beechwood in Cheltenham. It loses money. It is the only piece of property in Britain that BlackRock owned that loses money. You need to sort it as a priority. And of course, the Beechwood was again a challenge because no disrespect, and I'll probably go to hell for saying it, it was built by the church commissioners, and fair play, but they knew very little about retail, and it was just a very bad scheme from day one. It was never fully occupied. The anchor tenant couldn't be seen from the front, so that was Debenhams. The whole scheme had a sort of crank halfway up it, so you couldn't see the anchor tenant. It was all, and it's what we generally tend to refer to as a keyhole. You went in one way and you came back out the same way because it wasn't going anywhere. Whereas the Regent Arcade, you can pop in one end and pop out the other. A bit like the keys, you've got to get in different ways. So we started initially trying to sweet talk Debenhams into coming forward, but that wasn't going to. In parallel, was having conversations with John Lewis, because of course it was always threatened that John Lewis was going to Gloucester.
Yep. Right by the quays, if anybody knows.
Correct.
By McDonald's and Toys R Us, that area.
Correct. Yeah. Well, it was always written up in the Citizen as though it was going to King Square, which I knew was wrong. So I have a very good relationship with Peel, and we always share our secrets, simply because, as we've always said, it's not our decision. It'll be the decision for John Lewis Partnership Board. It doesn't matter what we offer on the table. So I know that Peel at the time were offering a really attractive proposition, which was the site you've just described, a significant cash incentive.
Yes.
And that's what was on offer there, compared to Cheltenham, which was a very, very tight deal because it was such a difficult site to deal with. So we actually went back to Shell and Core to rebuild it.
Can I just quickly stop you there, just while we're at this piece? Because obviously, knowing what we know now, do you think John Lewis made a mistake? Do you think they should have gone to where Peel is?
No, I think it was driven by their own marketing profile.
Right.
And I think that at that moment in time, Cheltenham and because access to the Cotswolds and North Cotswolds is very easy. I think that's what drove the decision. It wasn't one about, is it Gloucester, is it Cheltenham? It was just simply, they just went straight through their demographic profile, which of course they could get because they have Waitrose in Cheltenham. So everybody with a Waitrose card, bingo. They're like all these retailers, they're very cute. So in the end, it was Cheltenham that was decided on, and that was a challenging project.
Challenging working out all the roads, the traffic lights, and.
At the rear, it wasn't very difficult. Just that John Lewis made it quite clear that they wanted Albion Street to be two-way. They just said, we don't want to be on a one-way system. We don't get it. And so that actually became the first part of what was the Cheltenham Transport Plan. And they made it quite clear that they would only come if phase one was implemented. And GCC were quite happy with that. They didn't see that as a big problem. So that triggered phase one. And then, of course, in parallel to the John Lewis deal kind of working in the background, we were also dealing with what became known as Regency Place, which is the northern side of Albion Street, which is a really challenging site. So the former cinema, the former Odeon cinema, the Haynes and Strange, Baylis Haynes and Strange site, which prior to it being a garage was heavily contaminated because it was a tannery before that. And then you had a nasty 1960s shopping centre, a bit sort of arcade, a bit like the brewery had been. We seem to have a lot of them in Cheltenham, despite everybody saying how wonderful Cheltenham is. There's a lot of dross there, or there was.
A lot of dross.
So again, we needed a very brave developer to come in, and we found one. And basically, they said, "Look, if you can help us get the planning, it'll fly, but we can't hold it forever because it's contaminated, it's nasty, we don't want it." And that was some really challenging decisions, and it was one where I think it actually got pushed back to the councillors because they didn't understand. I went in and took some video footage. The whole site, the cinema site, had been completely trounced. There wasn't a square inch of plaster left on the walls in that building. There wasn't a piece of architrave. The whole thing had been gutted, but very professionally. And when I was in the council chamber and I said, well, this is what's happened. There was like outrage and all the rest of it. And I said, well, can I just turn the conversation around, please? Because actually, this is your fault. You put this building on the local listing index. So it's not listed, but you're saying it's of local interest. I said, and you didn't negotiate with the owner. The guy's in London. He just got served a letter saying it was on the local index. He panicked because he thought the next step would be you were trying to get it on the national listing. So he panicked, put a JCB in and completely gutted the place. So there's nothing left to salvage.
Right.
I said, that's what's called consequences of your action. So I said, my advice would be, if you want to do something, engage with the owner, and talk it through and see whether it's in both parties' interest. Just acting and saying, oh, we've put that on the local index. I said, you'll rue the day you did that, because that's what you did to that building. So in the end, we salvaged what became known as the celluloid entwined ladies, which were on the front of it. They were quite iconic. But the rest of the building was completely, they were saying, oh, it's got a good roof. And I said, no. I said, it's got a steel roof over an asbestos one, because they didn't take it up. I think they all went off. They just overlaid one. Again, it was doing one's homework that actually got into, eventually we kind of got to the point where councillors would come to us and say, could we do something with this? Rather than demanding it gets done. It's like saying, whoa, let's see if we can make it stack up. So that was another really interesting one. In terms of other projects that we've been working on, the quadrangle, which everybody's wanted to be repurposed for years. We were so pleased that that changed hands in the 10 years I was there. That changed hands 4 times.
Wow. Okay.
It's quite difficult to kind of get any traction with a project when every time it's, oh, we're just going to sell it on. But Associated British Foods Pension Fund are holding it now, and they're doing a sterling job. And I think it'll, and most importantly, it's staying commercial, because everybody feared it would go residential under permitted development rights. But by giving them the extra floor, which will become the roof restaurant, it basically makes it pay for them, because the refurb was so expensive. And I think it's that sort of psyche of understanding what works. Because so many, councillors say, well, why do you want a roof terrace? We'll say, well, because it makes the whole deal work for them. Because otherwise, they'll probably put it back to they'll go straight to resi, and they don't even need your permission. Oh, why is that? And I said, well, it's called permitted development rights. That's the law. Oh, and I said, so we can actually if we negotiate, we can probably both win something. So that's been a good one. Honeybourne Place, and some of the work that we've been working with, again, local developers, formal investments.
Farmer Construction, wasn't it? Honeybourne Place?
Farmer Construction built it, yeah, but it's formal investments who also have stuff in Gloucester, Tewkesbury, all over the place. Local, pretty visionary, brave people. So, for example, they repurposed Formal House in Cheltenham, which is the old storage centre, and it's kind of, I always described it as, it got a civic award, but it was almost like Manhattan Loft meets sort of Edwardian Cheltenham, and it's very niche, bespoke little office spaces, probably attracting some of the highest rents in Gloucestershire now. And then they built Honeybourne Place, which is the 80,000 foot brand new build, and again, that's nearly fully let. So it's about building confidence. And then probably the last, well, on and off, I've been involved with the cyber park. But my focus has generally been the infrastructure. So I've been heavily involved. So we won the money for the railway station because we knew we had to get the infrastructure right. So Cheltenham railway stations, given that it's got 2.5 million passengers a year, it's the busiest station by far in the county, but you wouldn't have thought so. It's very poor quality.
Yeah. How much money did you win for Cheltenham railway station?
It was about 5 million in the first round. So it's enough to actually, so that's done it's done the cycle hub, it's done the forecourt, it's done the upgraded car park, the extended car park. We're about to hit phase 2, which is the cycle link, and it's almost like you wouldn't have thought it's actually joined up thinking. So the cycle link allows you to cycle or walk all the way from the centre of Cheltenham to the station, from the station to the A40 at Lansdowne Bridge. And then that then meets up with the West Cheltenham Transport Improvement Scheme, which was a bid I wrote a couple of years back, and that secured £22 million, which is unlocking the A40, but also by doing that, it unlocks the pedestrian cycle link all the way from Lansdowne Bridge, all the way to Earl Court. And then there's another scheme that I'm just involved on the margins of, which is Highways England scheme, which means you'll be able to cycle from Cheltenham to Gloucester Station. So it actually all kind of joins up. So we've had that, and then I've been working the last 18 months on the Junction 10 bid with a team from Gloucester County Council.
Yes, I mean, something that's been, a lot of people have been screaming for Junction 10 for a long time. How close are we to seeing that? Spades in the ground and all the rest of it?
You're going to be a year or more off spades in the ground, simply because of the complexities of the scheme. But again, my role there was very much the housing led and the analysis of the housing numbers and the rest of it, because it was a Homes England scheme. So it's not about, for them, it's about infrastructure to unlock housing. It's not about infrastructure for infrastructure's sake. So so GCC, of course, have all the infrastructure skills, but they're sort of almost blindsided on housing because it's something they don't do. So there was a team of 3 of us brought in, 2 from Cheltenham, 1 from Tewkesbury, to help write that part of the bid, because that was what sold the bid. So yeah, and again, one of my roles was just to get loads and loads of local support. So again, I was able to reach out. I've got a pretty big network. I was able to reach out and say, I need letters of support, folks. This is again, had a lot of support. Again, the LEP were pretty instrumental in that. A lot of people are in those kind of same clusters. So that was very positive. They're trying rapidly now to get to contract. So once they get a contract agreed, that's the contract sum, then it's over to GCC to deliver it. So they're literally, so the money was announced in March, and we're well ahead. So obviously there's a whole load of preconditions. The government aren't going to give away 220 million at a whim. They actually want everything buttoned down, as you'd expect. They want to know what outputs they're getting. They want to know the whole process, the timelines, the risk profile, everything. And so there's been quite a big team of us working on that. But that, again, will be another game changer. But critically, it opens up the whole of that West Cheltenham. So you've got the cyber park, and the whole of that West Cheltenham. So you've got North West Cheltenham, which is the Bloor scheme. It opens up swathes of land that are currently safeguarded close to Junction 10, further land in West Cheltenham. It becomes strategically probably one of the biggest areas for development in the county, by a long way. So,
if I was going to ask you, what is the most proudest bit of development that you've done, or deal that you've managed to pull off in all these years that you've been working in the county?
That's an interesting one. I suppose the one that has the greatest longevity and probably the greatest legacy in terms of impact has to be the 3 colleges, because they're there now. They're doing, more apprentices come out through those than any other sort. So I suppose in terms of long-term impact, it has to be those. Anthony Priory was probably one of my biggest challenges, to buy a site for £1, and knowing it had a 3 million liability. In actual fact, it was 4 by the time we'd finished.
Right.
There was some interesting somersaults on that journey.
It's a shame because not many people know about it still. They've still got a bit of a job, but we've tried to promote it here at Punchline as much as we can, and give it a push, because I love that building. My office used to be right opposite, and I hate to admit this, Jem, I'm not sure if I've ever told you, but I used to chip golf balls over it when it was a rain shower. So obviously I hit the building quite a lot. Sorry.
It's about to hit a new phase anyway, because basically we've just drawn a line under the development work. So we're just waiting for the county to make the new road connection, which goes out to St Anne's Way, and then we can close up the existing way. And that, of course, then allows the Southwest Bypass to be completed. And then when you've done all those last bits, then really it becomes a heritage asset. And that's, so that there'll be a new chair. I got dragged back in as interim chair because there was a little bit of a crisis. So, but I'm leaving this summer again. And that's, so yeah. And then in Cheltenham, I suppose, most complex ones, I suppose the ones that really made a difference was that whole kind of Albion Street area. So Regency Place and John Lewis, they were the two that, because the brewery was, yeah, that would have happened somehow or other. I think all we tried to make sure was actually we accelerated it rather than having yet another public inquiry. So, but I think things like that were probably some of the bigger ones. But again, the legacy stuff will be the railway station, the A40, Junction 10, because that will see us through into the next, hopefully through the next few cycles of the economic cycle. So
you never got involved in the A417 then, or anything like that as well? Was that part of you, or was that too far?
No, only I was on the margins of it, so I know all about it. And again, I was helping that was Highways England promoting that one. To help garner support when they were looking for it, because they were out consulting and so forth. And obviously for a lot of business in Cheltenham, it was same as in Gloucester, it was very important. So, but in terms of detail and who's running it, that's Highways England, because I'm aware that it's actually may have to go back to further consultation yet. I saw that the other day.
Right, okay, funny that. Before we finish, what are you going to do next, Jem? You've obviously spent the last 25 years building Cheltenham, building Gloucester, turning all around, turning all the colleges. how the hell are you going to be, be bored out of your tree, weren't you? You're going to be sitting at home. Are you actually retiring or
yeah, I actually am, believe it or not, I am of an age where I can retire. I do plan to not slow down, but as in I don't want a full-time job anymore. I probably will look at some things if they come across my desk. It's a nice position to be in. Yeah, ostensibly the plan was to the real thing was to create some windows to go traveling a bit further. Unfortunately, I clearly didn't have COVID-19 on my risk analysis.
I was going to say, timing's pretty bad. Bad. If you could have travelled, where would you have gone?
Travelled quite a lot, but a couple that have eluded us. So we wanted to go to New Zealand, but wanted to do it kind of, I don't want to go just in for 10 days or whatever. I want to do it properly. And I want to go to India, because neither of those we've visited. And then there's lots of other bits of other places where we've been. We want to go back and explore further. So there's always places to go. So that's, I suppose that one of those strange things, it must be my DNA. I actually did manage to complete a degree at one point in my life, and it was economics and geography. So the geography gives me the traveling, and the economics gives me the kind of regeneration. It's quite an interesting mix. Not as a mixture that many people do these days, but it was quite an unusual one when I first did it. And I suppose it does kind of give you the skill sets for regeneration. It is about understanding where, everybody talks about placemaking now, and was it in those days it used to have words like destination attractiveness. What was it that made people go somewhere? So the language has changed, but the principles haven't. I mean, that's the one thing about education. What goes around comes around.
I think that's a really nice place to stop. Jem, it's been a pleasure. I always love talking to you. I always learned so much, and I'm sure many of us here in Gloucestershire really appreciate everything that you've done over the last 25, 30 years. It goes without saying your legacy, is a footprint for us all to walk in. So thanks ever so much, and you've always been a kind gentleman as well. I'd just like to say I've always appreciated that. So whenever we've crossed paths, and I know lots of people when we put a post on there on LinkedIn, and obviously the article we wrote about you stepping down, lots of nice feedback from that as well. So many people feel the same way I do. So please, sir, have a happy retirement. Thanks for joining us here, and hopefully I'll see you very soon for a pint, maybe. I'm sure I will be around. I won't be disappearing. Cheers, sir. Bye, Mark. Cheers. Bye-bye.